Everyone. Out of the 196 countries in the world. Do you know how many still enforce the death penalty? Approximately 70% of the world's countries and regions have abolished the death penalty, or no longer carry it out in practice. One such country is the United Kingdom, which abolished the death penalty in 1965, and now stands among nations without capital punishment. However, in the mid-18th century, the UK passed a law that introduced a punishment even more terrifying than the death penalty. This is the theme of today's historical journey, the Murder Act of 1751. So, what exactly was the Murder Act of 1751? What social circumstances led to its creation? And how did it impact people at the time? Let us now delve into the terrifying reality of the Murder Act of 1751 together. Let us first explain the historical background of the time when the Murder Act was enacted in England. The mid-18th century falls slightly before the Victorian era, a time when England underwent significant development due to the Industrial Revolution. During this period, the agricultural revolution was taking place in England. Advancements in agricultural techniques allowed for a stable food supply, leading to population growth. Additionally, individual productivity improved dramatically, which meant that not everyone needed to work in the fields as they had before. As a result, many people who no longer had work in agriculture began flocking to large cities, like London, in search of jobs. Many of these workers had no private housing and were crammed into dormitory-like accommodations, living in harsh communal conditions. Needless to say, such living situations often led to conflicts among people, resulting in an increase in crimes such as assaults and murders, leaving many to suffer in poverty. For some, the only way to survive was to resort to theft. Meanwhile, factory owners and capitalists were reaping significant profits, which only widened the gap between the rich and the poor, leading many to turn to crime out of desperation. This was the state of England in the mid-18th century. In 18th century England, where crimes occurred as if they were part of everyday life, modern police organizations, as we know them today, did not yet exist. No matter how rampant crime became, law enforcement was far from sufficient to deal with it. In large cities like London, there were paid night watchmen known as Charlies. However, their duties mostly involved escorting drunkards home at night or walking the streets, announcing the time, which was far removed from the functions of modern police organizations. Thus, in the early 18th century, the cities of England were environments where crime was prevalent, yet properly policing them was virtually impossible. In such a situation, where crimes were frequent, but could not be effectively controlled, the solution was to impose harsher punishments as a warning to potential criminals. That being said, punishments for crimes in England were already quite severe by this time. Offences punishable by death included treason, murder, piracy, and other heinous crimes. It is not surprising that the death penalty was applied to such serious offenses. However, during this period, even much lesser crimes could result in a death sentence. For example, crimes such as blackmail, embezzlement, and insurance fraud offenses that would never result in the death penalty in modern times were often punishable by death, where almost anything could result in the death penalty. Interestingly, among this vast number of death sentences, the most common offense was somewhat surprising: forgery. The crime of forging documents accounted for 1/3 of all death sentences. Why was forgery such a common and harshly punished offense? The reason lies in the following historical context. From the mid-17th century, England experienced a surge in trade, particularly with the North American colonies, marking the advent of the so-called Commercial Revolution. Trade involved transactions with various countries, and using each country's currency for trade was cumbersome. To simplify transactions, documents such as bills of exchange and promissory notes were introduced as substitutes for money. Documents, which could be used to move money, became prime targets for forgery. At the same time, England was undergoing what is known as the Financial Revolution. During this period, England was at war with France, and to finance military expenses, the British government established the Bank of England and began issuing government bonds. This led to the creation of bond certificates, which also held monetary value. Additionally, the British Parliament introduced new taxes to secure more revenue. To facilitate and confirm these tax payments, royal seals and stamps bearing the king's mark were used. These government bond certificates and royal seals also became targets of forgery. At the time, there were no modern techniques, like advanced printing technologies, to prevent counterfeiting. Large sums of money were represented by simple pieces of paper, all handcrafted. In this environment, many criminals sought to profit by forging these valuable documents. Forgery was strictly prosecuted because it directly threatened the assets of the state and the wealthy. This resulted in frequent death sentences for such crimes. Certainly, the harsh legal system of the time was intended, in part, to serve as a deterrent to crime. However, it also served another purpose: protecting the wealth and interests of the affluent lawmakers. As a result, not only heinous crimes such as murder, which endangered human lives, but also financial crimes involving money and property, were aggressively punished with the death penalty. In this way, 18th century England saw the death penalty applied to numerous offenses. The sheer number of executions resulting from this harsh legal system led to the later nickname for English law. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, the bloody code. In such a situation, the measure introduced in England to further reduce crime was the Murder Act of 1751. The solution they devised was to make the method of execution for murder even more brutal. The execution methods prescribed by this act were as follows. First, those sentenced to death for murder were to be hanged with chains and left hanging after execution, or subjected to public dissection. Additionally, the executed body was not to be buried. For Christians, this was a major issue. Christian belief holds that after death, a person is called to God and will eventually be resurrected. For this resurrection, it was considered important that the body be buried intact, without damage. Thus, a death sentence that included dissection, leaving the body mutilated and unburied, was seen as a hopeless fate that made resurrection impossible. Furthermore, those sentenced to death were not allowed to meet with clergy, denying them the opportunity to atone for their sins and seek forgiveness. For people of that time who believed in resurrection after death, this was far more terrifying than merely facing execution. Being left hanging on display after execution was also a humiliating act that brought shame to the remaining family members. But the Murder Act affected not only the condemned, but also their families and loved ones in more direct ways. For instance, if anyone assisted the criminal in escaping, they too could be sentenced to death. Even attempting to recover the body of a family member who had been executed was illegal and punishable by 7 years in prison. In this way, the death penalty under the Murder Act of 1751 was designed not only to bring death but also to impose religious despair, public humiliation, and the fear of involving loved ones. Under this Murder Act, the first criminal to be convicted was a teenager named Thomas Bilford. In June 1752, Thomas was executed by hanging at Tyburn, a site that attracted many spectators for public executions. His body was subsequently dissected in public and treated as a model for studying the internal structure of the human body. So, how did people feel about these terrifying execution methods? Of course, many feared this brutal murder act. However, at the same time, there were also many spectators who eagerly anticipated these executions. Evidence of this can be seen in Tyburn, where Thomas was hanged. It was a popular site for witnessing executions. In the middle of the road stood the execution platform, known as the Tyburn Tree, and villagers took advantage of the crowds by setting up paid viewing seats to earn money. In some cases, bodies taken down from the gallows were delivered to surgeons for public dissection. These dissections were also treated as spectacles. On busy days, tens of thousands of spectators reportedly gathered to witness the events. An English artist named William Hogarth, who attended an actual dissection in the mid-18th century, depicted the scene in one of his paintings. In the artwork, crowds are shown gathered around a corpse as surgeons remove internal organs and extract the eyeballs. The painting even portrays a gruesome moment where a dog bites into a heart taken from the body. Meanwhile, among the spectators, some are seen chatting or reading books, creating an eerie and unsettling contrast. This disturbing painting was part of a 4-panel series Hogarth created to criticize crime and the terrifying nature of punishment. The final panel in the series, featuring the public dissection, was intended to convey the horror of what awaited those sentenced to death. While the Murder Act aimed to reduce crime through the power of punishment, Hogarth, as an artist, sought to change society through the power of imagery. Interestingly, the Murder Act was, in a way, quite useful to certain groups of people. The bodies used for public dissections under the Murder Act were indispensable for medical students to learn anatomy and for advancing medical knowledge. For medical professionals and the British Parliament, the Murder Act also served as a legal means of obtaining bodies for dissection. This practicality contributed to the law remaining in effect for more than 50 years. However, calls for the abolition of the law emerged early on, and its contents were gradually revised. In 1823, it was other than treason and murder could no longer be punishable by death, and in 1837, the mandatory death penalty for those who helped death row inmates escape was abolished. During this period, there was also an increase in cases where transportation was used as a punishment instead of the death penalty. The primary destination for transportation was Australia, then a British colony. Between 1788 and 1868, over 160,000 convicts were sent to Australia. The last public execution was carried out in 1808, after which executions were conducted within prison walls. Later, events such as World War II and the mass genocide committed by the Nazis led to a re-evaluation of the value of human life, sparking active debate about the death penalty in England. As a result, the death penalty was finally abolished in 1965. The Murder Act was founded on the idea that harsher punishments would reduce crime. However, there is no clear conclusion about how effective the law was in deterring crime or reducing crime rates. Even today, there are countries where the death penalty exists and is still enforced. There are many lessons to be learned from the history of the death penalty in England. The history of the world is still full of mysteries. Let us continue to embark on journeys together to uncover these mysteries. Until the next journey, thank you for watching.